Welcome to the 33rd presentation of the annual Michelle and Peter Burton Memorial Lecture on Japanese Art series at LACMA. My name is Hollis Goodall, and I'm curator of Japanese art. The title of tonight's lecture by Dr. Yurika Wakamatsu is The Tapestry of Literati Landscape, Okuhara Seiko's Spring Colors on the Sumida River of 1887. We're excited about the response to this program with over 210 RSVPs, which is a record for our Burton lecture series. We used to have a auditorium that only took 116, so we would be bursting at the seams today. In this day and age when it feels like the best we can hope for is to get a decent haircut, it is phenomenal that we are able to partake of contemporary scholarship as it is produced in an online setting. The Burton Memorial Lecture Series was established on the occasion of the opening of the Pavilion for Japanese Art in 1988 and dedicated initially to the memory of Michelle Burton. Mrs. Burton, having lived in Japan, brought a love of Japanese art and culture into her work as a docent at LACMA, and she also brought friends, a few of whom have worked with me through the entirety of my 39-year career here. The lecture series was established by Michelle's family, in particular her husband, Dr. Peter Burton, called by some the Einstein of Asian studies, with the purpose of advancing research in Japanese art. I have a couple of notes of housekeeping. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen during the program, and Dr. Wakamatsu would be happy to answer as many questions as time allows after the lecture. You may also use the Q&A button to direct questions to our AV team should you have technical issues. And here I would like to say thank you to Christine Drossi in the Japanese department, Cello Montoya and her team in education, and Jessen Duhler in AV, as well as Dr. Wakamatsu for bringing this talk to fruition. One other note, for the most optimal viewing experience, we recommend that you switch to speaker view and drag the speaker view to the bottom right corner of your screen. That way you'll get to see as much of the screen as possible. Our speaker today is Dr. Yurika Wakamatsu, who received her PhD from Harvard University in 2016, specializing in Japanese literati art, in addition to gender studies and literature. Her research has focused upon literati women artists of the Meiji period, which lasted from 1868 to 1912. Following a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard's Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, Dr. Wakamatsu in 2017 became assistant professor of East Asian art at Occidental College, and we're so happy to have her in the neighborhood. She's a fantastic teacher. I hosted her class once when they came to look at prints in person back when that was possible, and she communicates so well. So today we're pleased to hear that her recent groundbreaking work was just published in the journal Archives of Asian Art in an article entitled Imagine Selves, Mediating Desires and Subject Positions in the Japanese Literati Art of Okuhara Seiko, 1837 to 1913. Dr. Wakamatsu will focus in this lecture on a single painting with a dense layers of meaning entitled Spring Colors on the Sumida River. Welcome, Yurika.
Thank you so much, Hollis, for such a kind introduction. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss my research with you, and I really look forward to your questions and comments. So I will share my screen. The present pandemic has locked our minds and bodies in their homes. Many of us are searching for alternative ways of working, socializing, and finding solace in these challenging times. Now our world is filled with virtual events, virtual lectures, virtual concerts, virtual theaters, even virtual travels. Thanks to the internet, We can transport ourselves instantly with the click of a mouse. But what did people in the past do when they were confined to the home? How could one travel to a distant place from the comfort of one's home without Zoom, Netflix, or YouTube? In 5th century China, a painter named Zongbing contemplated such questions when his old age and infirm body no longer allowed him to travel to the famous mountains that he so cherished. Longing to revisit those mountains, he brushed all of the places he had visited on the walls of his room. Viewing the paintings from the comfort of his bed, the painter was able to transport himself in an almost dreamlike way to far-off landscapes. Zong's murals do not survive, but a painting like this, which seems to have been designed specifically for recumbent roaming, gives us a sense of what his paintings might have looked like. His biography tells us that he was so attuned to the universe that he could bring his memories of mountains to life through painting. He could imaginatively roam through those landscapes, and he could even hear the sound of his zither resonating within them. And he could do all of this even when confined to his home. This idea of roaming while reclining, woyou in Chinese and gayū in Japanese, was central to Chinese traditions of landscape painting from the 5th century onward. And it was received with enthusiasm by Japanese artists as well. The 18th century poet-painter Hattori Nankaku was so inspired by Zong's dreamlike journeys that he too painted the walls of his abode so that he could stroll imaginatively among hills and waters in his old age. Nankaku's wall paintings are now lost, but they might have been painted in this kind of style. Next to his wall paintings, Nankaku is said to have inscribed a long poem, which implied that he was so in tune with the painted landscape that he could observe clouds forming, rain falling, and wind blowing. Ultimately, the paintings allowed him to understand the workings of the cosmos, even though he remained reclining leisurely in his room. Zong's biography and Nankaku's poem were written in different cultural contexts centuries apart, but they both present the painters as skillful practitioners of vicarious travel. In old age, they each wandered through painted mountains and rivers and pursued communion with nature with ease. In order to become such proficient roamers, they cultivated specific skills of roaming, both active and recumbent. Only through such practices could they engage with landscape fully, perceiving its physical features and savoring the sensory pleasures they afforded. How exactly can a work of art facilitate the beholder's journey into landscape? How can an object help the viewer leave the confines of the home and become attuned to the sights and sounds of a distant, even unfamiliar locale? And most importantly, how does one become a skillful roamer? In the next 45 minutes, we will explore these questions by looking closely at this painting, Spring Colors on the Sumida River, which was produced by the Japanese artist Okuhara Seiko in 1887. The work is currently mounted as a pair of 2-panel folding screens. It's rendered in ink and pigments on silk. The entire painting is about 70 inches high and 140 inches wide. Seiko was born in 1837 as the 4th daughter of a high-ranking retainer in the Koga domain, today's Ibaraki prefecture. In 1865, Seiko left her family home for Edo, which soon became Tokyo, to pursue a career as a professional painter. Seiko specialized in literati art, a combined practice of painting, poetry, and calligraphy, first formulated by scholar officials in 11th century China. In Japan, literati art rose to great popularity in the mid-19th century, and Seiko was a central figure in this literati art boom. She became widely known for her exuberant ink landscapes and her willfully distorted style of calligraphy. Simultaneously, she cropped her hair and dressed in men's kimono, despite new government ordinances that prohibited cross-dressing and women sporting short hair. In 1891, after spending more than 2 decades working as an artist and educator in the capital, Seiko left the metropolitan art world to retire to rural Kamikawakami in Kumaigaya City, Saitama Prefecture. There, Seiko continued to paint for her patrons while traveling throughout the archipelago. Seiko's works were widely collected during her lifetime, but few are held in American collections. LACMA owns a single painting by Seiko, an autumn landscape created in 1911, shortly before her death in 1913. The work that will be the focus of my talk, Spring Colors on the Sumida River, depicts a sweeping view of the Sumida River in Tokyo at the height of spring. It offers an ideal case study to examine how landscape painting allows the viewer to attune to a distant landscape by means of recumbent roaming. It is appropriate as such a case study for 2 main reasons. First, this Sumida Riverscape was made specifically for a patron who was living 160 miles away from Tokyo. Second, the patron was 22 years junior to the artist. At the time this work was made, he was only 28 years old, while Seiko was 50. So the work was designed to entice and engage a patron who was not as familiar as the artist with the Sumida River, its important place in literati culture, or the practice of armchair travel. My goal today, then, is to investigate how Seiko's work enabled the viewer to cultivate his skills of roaming the riverscape while reclining on the floor of his distant studio. Here is a roadmap of our exploration. We will first look at how Seiko's painting depicts the famed Sumida River. We will then explore the context of its patronage. Next, we will examine how the place visualized in Seiko's work was imagined in 19th century Japan. This will provide a context for understanding a long poem inscribed on Seiko's painting, which describes the experiencing of roaming the Sumida Riverscape. Finally, we will investigate how the painting and the poem combine to facilitate the viewer's engagement with the riverscape. Ultimately, I will argue that if we attend to what is depicted in the image and its accompanying poem, we are immersed in a specific mode of engaging with the riverscape, a mode that was established in the Edo period and that continued to function in the Meiji period. In other words, Seiko's work allows us to tune in to the manners of appreciating and interacting with the Sumida Riverscape, current in 19th century Japan. It teaches us to become skillful visual roamers of this site in a manner specific to that historical moment. Throughout this talk, I will use the term riverscape to refer to the physical river and its banks, representations of the river in painting, poetry, and other media, and perceptions and conceptions of the river. I refrain from making a clear distinction among them because, like many other famous places, the physical place its representation, and its image in the mind mutually affect and shape each other. We will see that these three understandings of the Sumida River were intimately interwoven in 19th century Japan. So what exactly is Seiko's painting? Spring Colors on the Sumida River presents a panorama of the Sumida River from west to east. That is, the painting situates the viewer on the western bank of the river, looking toward the east. North is to the left, and south to the right. The foreground represents the western bank of the river. Matsushiyama Hill, an important landmark on the river, dominates the lower right corner, while tall trees and houses densely fill the area to the left. The eastern bank stretches across the middle of the composition, separated from the foreground by the Sumida River itself. The eastern bank is represented in distinctive two-point perspective, its closest point placed near the center of the left screen. The bank recedes to both sides, creating a clear, expansive view of the far-reaching dike on the right, and a shorter, hazier view of the dike's abrupt curve to the left. The most distinctive feature of this riverscape is the bank's innumerable cherry trees adorned with light pink blossoms. The Sumida River had been celebrated for these trees since the 18th century. The riverscape appears calm and quiet. The only sense of movement is implied by small sailboats. Further, the painting is almost devoid of any sense of human presence. Only a few boatmen appear, rendered anonymously in minute ink silhouettes. Dense clusters of low buildings populate the foreground bank, but their interiors are empty, making the place appear silent and still. The absence of explicit portrayals of human figures provides the viewer with a privileged perspective, a sense that the viewer is the sole beholder of this vast vernal vista. The use of two-point perspective in rendering the eastern bank situates the viewer in a single specific site on the foreground bank. At the same time, the negative space that fills the lower reaches of the painting creates a sense of separation between the observing subject and the observed view. As a result, the painting seems to turn the viewer into a distant beholder who surveys the site from a privileged vantage point. But a closer analysis of the painting in relation to the inscription reveals that the work also transforms the viewer into an active participant in the sensory experience of the riverscape, as we will see later. Why did Seiko create such a painting? For whom was this riverscape intended? The final lines of the inscription indicate that the work was commissioned by Hasegawa Shiun, or Hisaiie, one of Seiko's most important patrons. The Hasegawas were a wealthy farming family who had served as landlords in Tsukanoyama, today's Nagaoka city in Niigata Prefecture, since the early 17th century. The main building, Omoya, of the Hasegawa residence still survives. It dates to 1716, making it the oldest surviving vernacular house in Niigata Prefecture. Seiko seems to have enjoyed a close relationship with the Hasegawas throughout her life, painting not only for Hisaiie, his parents, and his son, but also for another branch of their family. Two of the letters that Seiko sent to the Hasegawas discussing the commission of spring colors on the Sumida River survive. They offer invaluable insights into the circumstances of this production. The letters suggest that Hisaiie asked Seiko to execute a painting of the Sumida River with cherry blossoms and willows in commemoration of the renovation of an annex building at his residence in Tsukanoyama. The annex building of the Hasegawa residence was renovated in 1887, the year inscribed on Seiko's painting. This is the plan of the residence. This is the main building, Omoya. This is the annex behind Omoya, and these buildings are connected by a corridor. This is what the first floor of the annex looks like. And when you take the stairs to go to the second floor, this is the east room that you will see on your right. And this is the west room that you will see on your left. An oral tradition in the Hasegawa family holds that Hisaiie originally intended to install Seiko's painting as fusuma sliding doors, sliding door panels to separate the two adjacent rooms on the second floor of the building. Hisaiie would have entered the west room and closed the sliding doors behind him so that he could see Seiko's painting installed on these doors. But in order to prevent the painting from being damaged by constant opening and closing of the doors, the family subsequently remounted the sliding door panels as a pair of two-panel folding screens. Seiko seems to have taken this intended space into consideration when creating the work. She employs a low horizon and includes an inscription at the upper right edge, leaving a large empty space in the upper register of the work. So the composition of the painting assumes a low viewing position. Indeed, Hisaiie likely enjoyed viewing the painting in the private setting of his upstairs studio. Closing the painting doors, he would have sat or reclined on the floor to gaze at this expansive vista. By installing the painted doors on the east side of the west room on the second floor of the annex, and by secluding himself in that small space, Hisaiie might have imagined himself in Tokyo, overlooking the Sumida River from west to east in the same direction as the painting depicts the site. Seiko, on the other hand, lived in the Shitaya district, today's Ueno Yonchome, in Tokyo, which was less than 2 miles away from the west bank of the Sumida. And she was intimately familiar with the river. Seiko's letters reveal that she took a boat ride along the river to sketch the scenery when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. And her sketch actually survives. Curiously, though, the finished painting significantly departs from the sketch. The painting presents an expansive vista and situates the viewer in an elevated vantage point far away from the dikes. But in the sketch, the trees and buildings on both banks, as well as the boats on the water, are proportionally larger than those in the final image. The sketch that situates the viewer closer to the water, making the river appear narrower. The final painting stretches the riverscape, both vertically and horizontally. The boats in the painting are so small in relation to the river that the significant gulf seems to lie between the two banks. Most conspicuously, the painting expands the view to the left to include the river's abrupt curve to the northeast, using fading washes to suggest deep space. Such sudden curvature is absent in the sketch. Instead, the river continues horizontally to the left, with both banks remaining parallel to the picture plane. So the painting accentuates the eastern bank's recessions into depth on either side of the composition, imbuing the scenery with a sense of infinitude. As this comparison with a sketch suggests, spring colors on the Sumida River is not an unmediated direct copy of the actual scenery. Instead, it actively engages with the manners of gazing, experiencing, and representing the Sumida River that were established during the Edo period and continue to play a role in the Meiji era. So how was this particular section of the Sumida River imagined in 19th century Japan? What kinds of experiences did the place afford to visitors and inhabitants. Seiko's painting depicts a very specific section of the eastern bank, notably the section north of the Azuma Bridge, which is dimly visible at the right middle edge of the painting. This area of the east bank was known as Mukojima, which literally means the island over there. In this map of the Edo region from 1843, Mukojima is shown at the northeastern edge. It was separated from the city's center in the southwest by the Sumida River. Although this low-lying area was prone to flooding, it provided fertile agricultural land, and Mukojima became a major supplier of produce to Edo. In fact, Mukojima was often represented as a bucolic agrarian landscape throughout the Edo and early Meiji periods. Located near the city of Edo, Tokyo, this northeastern region of the Sumida Riverscape marked an urban periphery. It constituted a liminal space between river and land, city and countryside, and the past and present. This liminality of the Sumida River was essential to Edo and Meiji period representations of the site. The reality and the representation of the riverscape shaped each other. The in-betweenness of the site is captured in this 8-panel folding screen, spring view of the Sumida River, painted by Kuwagata Keisai in 1821. Keisai worked as a print designer before becoming an official painter to the daimyo of Tsuyama domain in today's Okayama prefecture. In this large pictorial space, Keisai offers a bird's eye perspective of the river from east to west in the direction opposite from Seiko's painting. The eastern dike runs parallel to the picture plane in the foreground, as though to invite the viewer to physically move across the long stretch of the embankment. Keisai uses washes and tiny dots to depict the extensive fields on both sides of the dike, emphasizing Mukojima's rustic emptiness. In contrast, buildings crowd the other side of the river. And Seiko continues this habit of representing the Sumida River banks. While only a few buildings are visible through the trees on the eastern dike, the western bank is filled with buildings. Such representation seems to characterize this section of the Sumida River as mediating the urban cityscape and the rural landscape. In the background of Keisai's screen, Mount Fuji looms large in silhouette near the center of the composition. Beneath the mountain are the tile-making yards of Imado, which was famous for the reproduction of roof tiles. An image of smoke rising from kilns became an iconic view of this section of the river, as can be seen in this print by Utagawa Hiroshige. Over the centuries, the section of the Sumida River that both Seiko and Keisai depicted became a major repository of stories, legends, and collective memories that enabled visitors to travel through time, mediating past and present. Of the numerous stories associated with the site, the 10th century classic, Tales of Ise, is the oldest and most frequently cited. In section 9 of the tales, the protagonist descends to the east from the capital of Kyoto. While crossing the Sumida River, he spots white birds with red legs and beaks. When he learns that they are called birds of the capital, miyakodori, which is often translated into English as seagull, he feels a pang of homesickness and composes this poem to express his longing for the lover whom he left behind in the capital. This story became so attached to the Sumida Riverscape that no representation of the river was complete without a reference to the Tales of Ise, as Paul Whaley has noted. And Seiko's painting is no exception. Near the foot of Matsuchiyama, we find white birds flying and floating on the water. But this is just one of many stories that the riverscape accrued over time. Another old story that emerged in this area concerns Wakamatsu, a noble boy who is kidnapped in Kyoto to be sold into slavery and dies along the Sumida River. The Mokuboji temple became the site of the burial mound for Umewaka, and this legend inspired the production of many no, kabuki, and puppet plays. There were also miraculous events. For example, at Chomeiji Temple, the first Tokugawa shogun Ieyasu is said to have recovered from an ailment after drinking water from the temple well. In 1693, the poet Takarai Kikaku offered a poem praying for rain to Mimeguri Shrine. The poem is believed to have brought an end to a drought that year. As the riverscape accrued such stories and images, the abstract space of the riverbanks became a constellation of famous places. And these famous sites in turn called for more writing, picturing, and reimagining. One of the ways that Edo and Meiji writers and artists re-envisioned the Sumida riverscape was by creating a double image. We saw earlier that Seiko's painting expands the riverscape both vertically and horizontally. This visual dramatization of the Sumida River resonates with poetic representations of the riverscape, specifically with representations refracted through Chinese poetic tropes. Indeed, it was a common practice among Japanese kanji Semitic poets to depict scenic sites in Japan through the mediation of Chinese literature. For example, in this poem, Hattori Nankaku transforms the Sumida River into the Yellow River inhabited by goddesses and immortals, while Matsushima Hill becomes a mythical mount. In reality, though, Matsushima is hardly a mountain, but merely a hill 30 feet in height. But just as Nankaku likens Matsushima to the mountain of immortals, Seiko depicts it as a lush, lofty mountain emerging from the mists below. By transforming the hill into a majestic mountain and situating it in an infinitely expanding vista, Seiko's painting adds a sense of otherworldliness to the otherwise ordinary scenery. Mukojima's rich literary associations, its panoramic vista, and its proximity to the city made the area a popular destination. In fact, points of interest multiplied in the region throughout the 19th century. In 1804, the wealthy antique dealer Sahara Kiku opened the Hyakkaen, an extensive flower garden on Mukojima. The garden was supported by artists and writers, serving as a cultural salon for them. Temples and shrines on the riverbanks became packed, particularly during the Kaicho unveiling ceremonies, in which icons and treasures that were normally hidden were revealed to the buying public. Mukojima was also close to the Yoshiwara pleasure quarters, which strengthened its association with entertainment. Soon, a number of restaurants and food stalls proliferated in the area, serving local delicacies such as carp, clams, and potatoes. So businesses that were directly linked to the recreation of city dwellers penetrated deeply into these suburban villages. Above all, though, Mukojima was extolled for the clouds of cherry blossoms on its embankment. Although the origins of planting cherry trees on the Sumida River banks are obscure, the 8th Tokugawa shogun Yoshimune is credited with establishing the site as a famous place for cherry blossoms. In the early 18th century, Yoshimune is said to have planted 250 cherry trees on the east embankment around Mokuboji Temple. Subsequently, local residents made a series of efforts both to maintain and to extend the rows of cherry trees along the east bank. By the 1850s, the cherry trees had reached the Mimeguri Shrine, as we can see in this map of Mukojima from 1856. And the planting of cherry trees continued into the Meiji period. But by the mid-Meiji, the trees had so aged and withered that the embankment no longer produced the vernal splendors that the crowds had once enjoyed. In 1883, 4 years before Seiko's work was completed, 1,000 cherry trees, a phenomenal number, were planted on the riverside. The project was headed by the entrepreneur Okura Kihachiro and the journalist and kanshi poet Narushima Ryuhoku. Notably, both of these men dwelled along the Sumida River. In fact, throughout the 19th century, the cultural and the political elite rushed to establish villas along the Sumida River banks in order to savor the scenic beauty and its literary associations. Seiko did not own such an estate along the river, but she seems to have visited her friends' villas occasionally. For example, the diary of Kido Takayoshi, an influential politician patron of the arts, mentions a party held at a villa on the East Bank in 1869, during which Seiko, Kido, and their friends entertained themselves by drunkenly painting and writing. Lamenting the decaying trees, Okura and Ryuhoku attempted to revive the vanishing beauty of this famed site by mobilizing their kanshi poetry group, whose members also resided along the Sumida. They erected a stele on the east embankment that recounts this planting project in detail. By creating such a monument, they inscribed their names physically on the ground and immortalized themselves in the collective memory of the site. Seiko's spring colors on the Sumida River, which celebrates the magnificence of the vernal riverscape, might be seen as participating in resurrecting the splendor of this scenic site. Because of the fame of the cherry trees, Mukojima was busiest during springtime. But by the early 19th century, the northern banks of the Sumida came to be seen as a year-round recreation area or a zone of leisure. As the Confucian scholar and writer Terakado Seiken noted, of all scenic beauties in Edo, the river Sumida is paramount. Its scenery varies through each of the 4 seasons. Its aspect alters from morning to evening. In other words, the riverscape served as a site where visitors and inhabitants could nurture their sensitivity to the seasonal rhythm of nature by roaming leisurely on or along the river. Eventually, specific sites along the river came to be celebrated for their beauty at a particular time of day or in a particular season or atmospheric condition. This practice was inspired by the 11th century Chinese poetic and pictorial theme, the 8 views of the Shaoenshan rivers. This was originally a series of poems and paintings of 8 views of a riverscape in southwestern China. Subsequently, these views and the poetic moods they evoked became a template for representing other landscapes throughout East Asia. For example, Hiroshige included 8 views of the Sumida River in his series Famous Places in the Eastern Capital. Sunset Glow at Imado, we saw earlier, comes from this series. This practice of assigning poetic themes to specific sites along the Sumida was developed even further in the Meiji period. In 1882, the playwright and critic Yoda Gakkai composed records on the 24 views of the Sumida River. Inspired by Gakkai's records, the poet Mizoguchi Keigan added 6 more views and compiled poems on 30 views of the Sumida River in 1886, a year before Seiko completed the panoramic painting. In this 2-volume book, each view or poetic name is accompanied by a description or history of the site, a scenic poem that Keigan composed on it, and other poets' responses to Keigan's text and the site. The text is then followed by a visualization of the poetic name. 10 literati artists, including Seiko, were chosen to compose the images. These poems, descriptions, and pictures transform the riverscape into a patchwork of scenic spots, crowding the riverscape with names. But the book is more than a patchwork of names. It is an invitation to join in the collective acts of remembering, representing, and responding to the riverine sites. Specifically, the poetic name of each site, as well as Kagan's text and poem, call on other poets and painters to reflect on their memories of the site and to express their responses to it, either visually or textually. By attuning to the scenic sites of the riverscape and sharing affective responses to them, the participants in this book, including readers, form a literati community, a community based on their shared affective attachment to this place. And such a framework of sociality also seems to underlie Seiko's spring colors on the Sumida River. The key to understanding and accessing that community is to read the long inscription on the work and to join the poetic subject in roaming on and along the Sumida River. To the upper right of the painting, Seiko inscribes a Semitic poem in archaic seal script that celebrates the beauty of the vernal riverscape. The poem is full of place names that collectively demarcate the northern section of the Sumida River, but like Kagan's book, it is more than simply an assemblage of sites. Significantly, the poem describes the sensory activities in which the poetic subject engages on and along the river, immersing the reader within the riverscape. The poem's subject first crosses a Makura Bridge in the southeast and sees rosy haze gathering by the Mimeguri Shrine. Walking along the eastern embankment, the subject looks toward the western bank and gazes at Matsuchiyama and the pagoda of Sensoji Temple, illuminated in evening light. The poetic subject breathes in the fragrance of countless cherries, while seagulls peck at floating flowers. Hearing the sound of a temple bell drifting across the water, the poem's subject looks up toward Mokuboji Temple in the north. In the distance, Mount Tsukuba appears faintly. Finally, the host and the guests drift drunkenly along the river, serenaded by the sounds of zithers and lutes in the company of a famed courtesan. The poem evokes both bodily movements and diverse sensory stimuli, including sights, sounds, smells, and tastes. As the sights and sounds unfold in space, the time of the poem too progresses from afternoon to morning. Comprising a collection of sensuous delights, Seiko's poem provides ever-shifting perspectives that transpire rhythmically over the course of the day and night. By evoking the subject's sensory engagement with the riverscape, the poem enables the reader to experience the sight through or along with the ambling subject. We saw earlier that the painting at first glance seems to turn the viewer into a distant observer who surveys the site from an elevated vantage point. But when the painting is viewed in relation to the poem, the painting can no longer be understood as a single static scene that situates the viewer outside of its frame. Through the mediation of the poetic subject's corporeal experience of the site, the viewer becomes mobile, imaginatively roaming through the pictured scenery with the poetic subject. In fact, spring colors on the Sumida River employed specific mechanisms to facilitate the viewer's roaming through the riverscape. First, both the image and the text provide the beholder with multiple mobile views of the riverscape, evoking the sensation of wandering through the site. While the eastern bank's two-point perspective implies a fixed, singular viewing position, the foreground bank the foreground integrates multiple perspectives that imply and in turn create a mobile viewing subject, just as the poem evokes moving perspectives. For example, the houses throughout the foreground bank are depicted mostly from above and recede in depth, but Matsuyama and the many trees that populate the bank are viewed horizontally. Consequently, the foreground appears simultaneously flat and volumetric. This multiplicity of perspectives in the foreground, typical of Sino-Japanese literati painting, allows the viewer's eyes to move both laterally across the image and in and out of depth without settling in one place. As a result, the painting offers shifting angles of vision and a fluctuating mobile experience of a place, which together correspond to the ambulatory perspectives described in the poem. The painting and poem thus constantly resituate the perceiving subject in relation to the riverscape, enabling the beholder to wander imaginatively along the river. A subtle tension between text and image also facilitates the viewer's interaction with the represented scenery. Curiously, famous sites associated with this area of the river are clearly identified in the poem, but they are embedded more subtly within the painting. The poem explicitly names these landmarks, such as the Azuma Bridge, the Mimeguri Dike, Matsushiyama, as they are perceived by the roving subject, who seems to possess comprehensive knowledge of the riverscape. Although some of the landmarks extolled in the poem are visualized in the painting, they largely blend into the surrounding scenery. For instance, there are 2 torii gates that mark the entrance to shrines, but they are so small that they seem to be nestled in the landscape. Similarly, 2 mountains are depicted in the painting, but they are so lightly colored that they seem to fade away. When we read the precise poem and the panoramic painting in relation to each other, we understand that the poem's singing of specific sites encourages the viewer to search for the corresponding sites in the painting. The embeddedness of the sites within the painted landscape brings the viewer physically closer to the painting. Only after sustained attentive looking do hidden signs of the famous sites begin to emerge, giving the viewer a sense of discovery. So the painted panorama can no longer be instantly grasped. Rather, it anticipates the viewer's prolonged observation, that is, their continuous roaming through the pictured scene. The artwork rewards close reading and careful looking. It trains us in modes of paying attention. Seiko's work was produced around the time when the scenic sites of Mukojima that so enchanted Edo and early Meiji observers were beginning to be lost, as the east bank of the Sumida River was developed into Tokyo's largest industrial zone. Within the next few decades, the sights, sounds, and smells of Mukojima were completely transformed. Its pastoral fields were turned into factories, and ferries were replaced by steamboats and iron bridges. Stevies were darkened by soot, while river water was tainted by runoff from factories. The sirens of steamboats and mechanical noise from factories dominated the soundscape. As the east bank of the Sumida underwent massive industrialization, modern Japanese novelists such as Nagai Kafu began to cast a distinctively nostalgic gaze on the Mukojima, expressing acute yearning for a bygone past. Painted on the cusp of these transformations, Seiko's work idealizes the Sumida River and the experiences it affords, but it does not necessarily present the riverscape as an unattainable Arcadia. Rather, the work enables the viewer to continuously interact with it. By attending to what is embedded in the image and eulogized in the poem, we are instructed in a distinctive 19th century literati mode of relating to the riverscape. This mode of engagement involves roaming the riverbanks on foot, drifting along the river while sharing wine and music, naming sites and collecting memories of them, and most importantly, attuning to the scenic sights of the riverscape to share affective responses to them. Seiko's work uses a mechanism of engagement that we examined earlier to encourage the beholder to carry out those practices repeatedly. In so doing, it heightens the viewer's sensory responses and affective connections to the place. In other words, the work encourages the viewer to go along with the flow of activities described in the poem, so that the beholder no longer remains a distant spectator, but becomes an active participant in observing, experiencing, and responding to the physical features and poetic moods of the environment. In short, the viewer becomes a skilled practitioner in attuning to the riverscape in a community-sanctioned manner. Immersed in the riverine mood, the viewer might share affective responses to the riverscape with the poet and the poetic subject, as well as the host and guests mentioned in the poem, who collectively eulogize the scenery. It is such sharing of affective attachment to the Sumida riverscape that the viewer can join a trans-temporal community of like-minded peers. Thus, even when the viewer is physically removed from the Sumida River, in the case of Seiko's patron in Niigata, or when the viewer is both spatially and historically remote, in the case of us modern viewers in the US, spring colors on the Sumida River enables the beholder to tune in to the sights, sounds, and scents of the riverscape, as well as a sense of community it affords. By immersing ourselves in the riverscape and moving through its sights, in short, by recumbently roaming through the artwork, the affordances of the place continually unfold before our eyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yurika. That was fantastic. And I think we all feel like we had never seen the painting before you began to talk about it. It is really a rich and amazing painting. And I'm wondering, I get to ask the first question, which is, were there other artists who were equally sort of dense and rich in their approach to landscape painting, or was she in particular very attuned to all of these different sensory experiences that she was able to convey?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again? I was trying to close my PowerPoint and I couldn't hear your question.
Oh, okay. Basically, what I want to know is what the painting is so rich and amazing. What I want to know about is Seiko. I mean, she was obviously a super well-educated and highly sensitive person with a lot of training in both poetry, calligraphy, literary history. And what I want to know is how does this work compare with other landscape paintings of the same time? It was clear in Kuwagata Keisai's painting that he was doing more of a kind of a true view painting. So where does hers fit into that scheme?
That's a great question. This painting can be seen as part of the true view genre of literary painting. And the use of two-point perspective, that sense of there-ness, that it seems to situate the viewer in a specific place at first glance, that kind of aspiration to naturalistic view is widely shared, not just among Meiji literary artists, but also late Edo period artists. So I think you're absolutely right that it's part of the true view landscapes.
I have a question from Thomas O'Leary. Hi, Tom. Are there any photographs available of the painting as it would appear when it's standing and folded? I think you may have answered that one. I would imagine it would give us a sense of movement that isn't communicated by the flattened view. So the original painting was made for Fusuma. So what do you imagine it would have, how do you imagine it would have changed the view as the doors were moving?
Oh, I see. Well, doors moving.
Yeah, because I mean, he's
Right.
not just sitting in there. He's also, people will come and come in, kudasai, you know, and it's part of the sort of movement of the environment.
And what's interesting is that you have to close the room, close all the doors in order to view the entire painting. So you kind of have to seclude yourself in that small space of the second floor of that annex building to view that painting. So that creates a private setting to engage with the riverscape, and that also privatizes your experience with the riverscape.
That's really interesting.
And yeah, I think it's I think that that's an oral tradition in the Hasegawa family that we understand that the painting was originally installed as sliding door panels. And when you display it, now it's mounted as a pair of 2-panel folding screens. And when you display the screens, they kind of disrupt the perspective. You know,
I bet. Because you're supposed to be sitting and looking at it kind of flat. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense that they were initially installed as sliding door panels as a flat painting rather than folding screens.
And I was also interested in the idea, in the fact that when you were sitting there looking at the paintings, it seemed as if your view just could continue leftward and you would see trees outside, so that in effect became a continuation of the landscape.
Yeah, that's true.
Particularly because it's on the second floor and you have a bird's eye view of the landscape, and then it's sort of added to the second floor view of the trees around you.
Right, yeah. And what's interesting is that the poem actually mentions new pavilions. I'm not sure what that is, but it could be referring to the newly renovated pavilion, the annex building of the Hasegawa residence. So it might be trying to situate Hasegawa residence on the Sumida River bank, and that further allows a viewer to imagine being there, being on the Sumida River bank and overlooking it.
Sort of having a flying building and landing there. So an anonymous attendee wrote in and said, "Thank you for this fascinating presentation. Can you say a little bit more about how Edo and Meiji people experienced the Sumida River? Are there any direct accounts of wandering along the river, boating, etc.? And was there a particular tour route that everyone followed?"
That's a great question. Yes, I wanted to show you more images of the Sumida River from the Edo and Meiji periods, but I had to cut them because I had too many slides. But there are many paintings and poems about people experiencing the Sumida River. I wanted to show you Ikeda Koson, Sakai Hoitsu's disciples painting, where that's a very interesting painting because it depicts the Sumida River with a little boat. It depicts the Sumida River from the Mimeguri Shrine, from the west side, from the east side of the river, and it was commissioned by a wealthy person, a wealthy farmer in Tochigi, who was visiting Edo and had a good time, but had enjoyed floating along the river with Koson and a few other people. And they asked Sakai Hoitsu, Koson's teacher, to inscribe the painting. And in it, he talks about roaming and enjoying floating on the river, and he likens it to Sushu's Red Cliff. And he calls the drifting along the Sumida River as an enjoyment or as a pleasure of the city. So floating along the Sumida River was an important aspect of was an important recreation mode of recreation at the time. And he also the question was also about the tour routes. That's a great.
That's right.
actually one of the most common ways of going to the Yoshiwara pleasure quarters was going along the Sumida River. And there are many paintings that depict boats going north upward toward Yoshiwara, and then you would get to Sanya, a place named Sanya, and then you would descend the boats, and then the Yoshiwara is just a short walk from there. And there are some scholars in Japan who talk about paintings of the Sumida River that do not necessarily seem to represent this route to Yoshiwara, but because of that very close association with Yoshiwara, paintings of the Sumida River that depict that river from west to east might have had this connotation, that might have evoked the pleasure of going on the river to get to Yoshiwara.
Okay, and I just want to define for people who don't know that the Yoshiwara was the licensed pleasure quarter that was actually placed out away from Edo, sort of to keep people from getting there too easily, and also because the initial gated pleasure quarter caught fire, and a lot of people were killed in that fire. So they wanted to make sure that it was safer from fire and also a little bit away from where people would be readily spending their money. So that's the west to east view, where you also get Mount Fuji, which is odd because you have sort of the sublime and the ridiculous, or the profane and the religious in a single view, looking from west to east.
Mount Fuji can be viewed from east to west, but actually there's a Japanese scholar named Wakatsuma Naomi who talks about contrasting ways of representing the Sumida River. And she argues that the views from east to west, that includes Mount Fuji, tend to emphasize the urbanity of the city of Edo. And the paintings, the opposite, paintings that depict the Sumida River from west to east tend to create a more bucolic atmosphere, including evoking the common route to Yoshiwara.
And I also just noticed, you mentioned a couple of very wealthy patrons and paying elite artists to paint these scenes, but then there was also Hiroshige, who was creating these prints for the hoi polloi, like you and I, to be able to enjoy these artworks, reminding us of the time we'd either spent or would have liked to have spent on the Sumida River. I had questions from actually at least 3 docents. Thank you very much, docents, for writing in. One of them would like to be reminded of the size of the painting.
Size of the painting. So it's about 70 inches, 70 inches high and 140 inches wide overall. So each screen is actually 70 inches wide and 70 inches high and 70 inches wide.
Oh, I see. Okay, right, because they went on doors. And then how would a viewer place him or herself in the recumbent position within the room? From the center of the room, with the head to the right, and also could that person then see from the windows? What was the view of the Sumida River paired with? I don't quite understand that. Because it was taking up one whole wall, then it wouldn't be paired with anything else except the actual garden view. But can you answer, was there a specific way that a person might recline in the room, or was it their choice?
I assume it was their choice, but there are tatami straw mats on the floor, so you could you'd probably sit down, or you can maybe recline on the floor to gaze directly at the painting. There also the room has 2 windows on 2 sides, and those had sliding doors as well. So the the doors could be opened, the windows could be opened, and maybe if you were on the ground, you could see the painting from outside.
Oh, that's interesting. How much of the energy transformed into this work of art is a result of idol worship of rivers and mountains, i.e. Shinto?
I don't think this is particularly a religious work. It's what's interesting is it's not emphasizing mountains. There are viewing mountains. Mount Fuji did have religious associations. Like Hokusai was a part of the Mount Fuji cult, but this painting seems to kind of de-emphasize mountains. But mountains were to be seen at this site, and there are many writings about seeing mountains on the Sumida River, and you could see Mount Fuji on your left, on the west, and Mount Tsukuba on your east, in the east. And there are many poems and writings about comparing Mount Fuji and Mount Tsukuba. And Mount Tsukuba and Mount Fuji came to be paired in many plays, poems, and paintings.
And I guess as far as feng shui goes, the position of the river was important, but with people boating towards the north, you're actually boating into dangerous territory as far as feng shui goes. So maybe it was a sort of anti-religious. We have lots more incredible questions, but we have blown past our time limits, unfortunately.
I can respond to one more. I can respond to the previous question more. So there was a pilgrimage route that was established on the East Bank, actually. So that elite artists and writers who really supported the Hyakkaen, the flower garden on the East Bank, were also interested in creating kind of attractions. And they actually created a pilgrimage route on the East Bank, visiting 7 gods. They identified 7 gods on the temples and shrines on the East Bank, and they created so that people could enjoy going either north or south, and collecting kind of auspicious merits by walking along the Sumida River.
Okay, and I would like to suggest to the people who have further questions about Okuhara Seiko and her time period and who she was, that you check out Dr. Wakamatsu's recent article in the Archives of Asian Art, which is not that easy to get hold of, but it's available through libraries. It's extremely informative about Seiko and her time period. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very, very much for this. You did for us exactly what I would dreamed you would have done, which is to really lead us into enjoying an artwork on so many levels.
Right.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. Also, it's been a great audience, and I really appreciate having received all these questions.